Have you ever heard a rumor that got so out of control it changed everything? Well, imagine that happening to an entire country. That's pretty much the story of the Great Fear in France, back in the summer of 1789. Let's break down how a massive wave of panic didn't just cause a little chaos, it actually helped fuel a revolution.
So what does happen when a whole country, already on the edge, completely panics all at the same time? Well, in this case, the answer would change the world forever.
All right, to really get what happened, we need to rewind a little. See, in 1789, France was like a giant pressure cooker. The tension was just unbelievably high, and the whole country felt like it was about to explode.
You had this perfect storm brewing. For starters, really bad harvests meant there wasn't enough grain. And when there's not enough grain, the price of bread, which was what almost everyone ate, goes through the roof. This led to massive hunger, and people were getting desperate. And who did they blame? The wealthy nobles, who they were already deeply suspicious of.
All that desperation was like dry kindling, just waiting for a match. And that match came in the form of some absolutely wild rumors that started spreading like, well, wildfire across the countryside. You have to remember, this was way before the internet or even telephones. Rumors spread by word of mouth. So a story would start, maybe about bandits being hired by nobles to steal what little grain was left. A traveler would hear it, tell it in the next town, and with each retelling, the story got bigger and scarier. Soon, this panic was literally leaping from one village to the next. But here's the crazy part. The bandits, they weren't real. There was no organized plot. The Great Fear wasn't about an actual threat. It was a physical reaction to the years of anxiety, hunger, and suspicion that had been building up. The real enemy here was fear itself.
And then something incredible happened. That crippling fear, it turned into action. The peasants, who were just regular farmers, got tired of being scared. They decided that if there were bandits coming, they were going to be ready. This was the moment everything changed.
Now, they didn't have cannons or muskets, but they had the tools from their farms. Pitchforks became pikes. Scythes, used for cutting grain, became weapons. They formed their own little defense groups, and they used the town's church bells not for services, but as an alarm system to warn each other.
This was a massive psychological shift. By picking up those tools and getting organized, they suddenly stopped seeing themselves as helpless victims. They realized that together, they were actually pretty powerful. They found strength and a voice in their unity.
With this new sense of power, their anger finally found a focus. They stopped worrying about imaginary bandits and turned their attention to the real source of their misery, the local landlords and the nobles who owned the land.
And listen, these weren't just chaotic riots. They were surprisingly organized. They marched on the big manor houses, but they weren't there to loot. They had a very clear, very smart objective. They were after paperwork.
Specifically, they were looking for documents called terriers. And no, not the dogs. Terriers were the official legal records that spelled out every single tax, fee, and day of unpaid labor that peasants owed to their lords. To them, these weren't just papers. They were literally paper chains, tying them and their families to a life of poverty.
And so they dragged these documents out into the castle courtyards and set them on fire. Can you imagine the power of that moment? For them, it must have felt like they were literally burning away the chains that had trapped their families for generations. This massive wave of peasant rebellion sent shock waves all the way to the politicians in Paris. The people in power suddenly realized they had a huge problem on their hands, and they couldn't ignore the countryside any longer. So as news of burning manor houses reached the government, the National Assembly, they started to panic too. They saw the whole country on the verge of a massive civil war, and they knew they had to do something and do it fast.
And that pressure worked. In early August, as the Great Fear was at its peak, something unbelievable happened. On the night of August 4th, in a wild, emotional session of the Assembly, the nobles themselves stood up and agreed to give up their ancient privileges. Just a few weeks later, it was official. The entire feudal system was abolished. Gone.
So what was this feudal system they got rid of? Well, think of it as an ancient social structure where if you were a peasant, you were legally tied to the land you worked. You owed the lord of that land your labor, a chunk of your crops as taxes, and total obedience. It was a system that had been in place for 1,000 years.
And getting rid of it changed everything overnight. Suddenly, peasants were no longer legally stuck on their lord's land. The forced unpaid labor was gone. All the special unfair taxes were abolished. For the first time, the goal was to have the same laws for every citizen, whether you were a farmer or a duke. This was a gigantic leap into the modern world.
It's really kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. The whole thing kicked off with some simple, unfounded rumors, and it ended with the complete and total collapse of a social system that had defined Europe for centuries. And the big takeaway from all this was clear. The Great Fear proved to the revolutionaries in Paris that the revolution wasn't just a city thing. The millions of ordinary people living in the countryside were now a massive political force. They had found their voice, and they could no longer be ignored.
You know, we always hear about the storming of the Bastille, and that was, of course, hugely important. But the Great Fear was just as critical in tearing down the old world. It really makes you wonder, could the French Revolution have even succeeded without this incredible nationwide wave of panic? It's definitely something to think about.